photo-wise.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the 55th webinar hosted at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at IZU Sabahattin Zaim University in Istanbul. Today we have a very special session and webinar titled Examining Western Stated Values, the Case of Julian Assange. I want to first hand it over to our director, Professor Sami Al-Arian. He is not only the director of our center, but also a known theorist on international relations, specifically on American foreign policy and the Middle East. He also is a activist for Palestinian rights and Palestinian anti-colonial activity. He has published a number of articles and books on various amount of subjects. For those who are first time joining in, I want to introduce also Dr. Driver, who is also joining us from the UK. Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Awais, and thank you, Professor or Dr. Deepa Driver, for being with us. Dr. Driver is an academic at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. She's also a trade unionist and a member of the National Executive Committee of the University and College Union. She has formerly served as financial regulator and has worked in consulting and in banking. She's a member of the Executive Committee of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers and serves as a legal observer in the case of Julian Assange on behalf of the ALDH, which is and the Haldane Society. Deepa is a university lecturer, as I said, teaching state and corporate accountability and financial regulation. Welcome, Dr. Driver. We're very delighted to have you, particularly on this subject. I've been concerned about this case for a very long time. Perhaps you can start by telling us the background of this. Those who have not been following this case closely, Julian Assange is the founder of WikiLeaks, which is one of the probably most important websites that has exposed in numerous ways millions and millions of documents about what governments do behind their citizens' backs. And of course, Assange has been a victim of global powers, as well as an ongoing saga that has taken place now for over a decade, I believe, and hopefully will be more enlightened by the end of this discussion. What we're trying to do here is to examine, as the title says, as the theme says, the Western stated values. We hear a lot about the freedom of speech, freedom of speech and freedom of academic freedoms and the freedom of press and freedom of knowing what's going on, and the Freedom of Information Act, and all kinds of things related to democratic values, accountability, transparency, rule of law, due process. All these issues are implicated in this case, and hopefully we can examine this with someone who's been very closely related to this issue. Dr. Driver has been an advisor, a consultant, but also a keen observer on this case. So hopefully we'll be able to probe deep into these issues. Dr. Driver, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you for this invitation. It really is a privilege to be on the same panel as you, Professor Al-Arian. And thank you very much, Mr. Han, for the introduction. I'm going to spend a few minutes setting the scene for people who are not that familiar with WikiLeaks, and to initially set out why WikiLeaks was so important, and why it is that, over these years, we have found that Assange has been focused on so much given that, whistleblowing and journalism have been there for a long time, and there are a lot of good journalists, there are a lot of important whistleblowers who've been talking to them. So why this focus on Assange? Why is he sitting inside a maximum security prison for the last 3.5 years, having also, experienced a mini stroke last year? So that's what I'll start with, and then I'll go on to explain what I have seen and what I have witnessed in the case as the legal observer. So, like many of you, I came to know about WikiLeaks when they started releasing information about Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo. And initially, I paid them attention because it was interesting that this very small organization, which we didn't know very much about, was telling us the real cost of the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and also what was really happening, who was winning, who was saying they're winning and actually losing, etc., etc. And like many people, I was shocked by what is now known as the collateral murder video. And for those of you who have never seen this video, I urge you to go to collateralmurder.wikileaks.org. And there is this rather horrific video of innocent civilians on the streets in Baghdad being gunned down by an American Apache gunship. And this Apache gunship, as it is killing these civilians, including a father who was driving past, saw that there was a man lying wounded on the street and tried to pick him up to take him into his van. And this father had his young children, 9 and 5, Doha and Sajjad, sitting in the van with him. And the American personnel gunned down the wounded person who was unarmed, which is of course a war crime, and gunned through the window of the vehicle, which resulted in very serious injuries to the children who were in the vehicle. In this particular incident, 2 journalists were killed, Namir and Saeed, and these 2 journalists were Reuters journalists, so they were internationally so-called supported. These kinds of killings were taking place in Iraq and Afghanistan all the time. For example, there was an 8-year-old child who used to collect sweets from the American soldiers, and one day one of the soldiers by mistake just gunned her down. So these were happening all the time. But when you see that 2 Reuters journalists are killed, you expect that perhaps now, because it's not necessarily just a black or brown life, somebody might pay attention. And Reuters investigated with the Americans what had happened, and the Americans tried to say to Reuters that their journalists had somehow gotten embroiled with a bunch of insurgents. And one of the journalists' cameras was mistaken for a rocket propeller, and therefore, this happened. The Americans, after the Reuters put in a Freedom of Information request to get the footage, the Americans took in a gentleman called Dean Yates, who was the Baghdad bureau chief for Reuters, showed him the video of what had happened, and he came away thinking this had been a terrible incident, but the Americans were really not to blame because, the journalist looking around the corner with his lens had been mistaken. Anyway, when WikiLeaks released their video, all of a sudden, the whole video was now shown, not just the selected extract of what the Americans wanted us to see, or wanted Reuters to see in this case. And when that video came out, we knew that innocent people had been killed intentionally. And the Americans sitting in the gunship were treating it like some kind of video game. And this really horrified people all around the world, because when we look at pictures, say, of Syria, of Libya, of other parts of the world sitting in Britain or America, I think when you see the bombs going off, it doesn't mean anything to you because, of course, intellectually this has happened, But the actual aftermath of what this does, the real lives that are involved, are so distant and so removed from you that you don't really understand how serious it is. And I think Collateral Murder, amongst the other WikiLeaks releases, changed the way in which we talked about war. And it was this courage of this small organization, because, you know, Chelsea Manning, who was then Bradley Manning, who released these videos to WikiLeaks, approached a number of mainstream, or rather was keen to give it to mainstream organizations. But it had been difficult for that publication to happen, because although a lot of people knew that on the ground in Iraq, and Patrick Coburn, you know, the famous journalist, says this, although a lot of people knew what was going on in Iraq, they didn't have hard proof. And this is why WikiLeaks is important, because in allowing whistleblowers to provide large quantities of data, and, you know, this is a big change from just having newspapers which provide you with information. Now you have, when WikiLeaks came on the scene, they changed from a very press-heavy media landscape to a multimedia kind of landscape, where you could have new volumes of information, lots of technology. And WikiLeaks married technology with journalism to allow whistleblowers to safely provide information to journalists, not just to the big journalists at the New York Times or the Guardian or the Washington Post, but also to Al-Akhbar, to Stefania Maurici at L'Espresso, and at all these other local important newspapers, which allow us to understand with quite a lot of depth what's really going on. Because somebody sitting in the Washington Post or the Guardian or the New York Times, firstly, has a very small attention span, and secondly, they also don't have the local knowledge to understand what is in the whistleblowers' disclosures. So WikiLeaks allowed for the information to be securely provided, for the whistleblower to be safe, for the information to go to large organizations as well as small organizations, and most importantly, and this is what is different about WikiLeaks, it allowed for the information to be tested and checked before it was put out. Now, if you think of any of your local newspapers, how many times have you seen a correction because they put some wrong information, or they said the wrong name, or they gave a different analysis? Whereas with WikiLeaks, they have a 100% record of accuracy, because they worked with very specialist experts like Andy Worthington, who is a specialist on Guantanamo, like Stefania Maurici, who knew about Italian corruption. And WikiLeaks, when it came on the scene, was new and special and different because it had this accuracy. What it also had was, it wasn't, and most of us know about WikiLeaks because of the releases related to war and war crimes, but WikiLeaks also released evidence of information about toxic waste dumping on the Ivory Coast, corruption in Arab Moist Kenya, so much information from so many different parts of the world in so many different spaces. And this became really important because people began to realize, we think when we read a journalist's article that we know what's going on in the world. But quite often we know what's going on in the world from the perspective of that one journalist. And sometimes the journalist keeps some things in, and sometimes they leave something out. And WikiLeaks, in allowing us to look at the actual information, not just to look at the journalist's opinion, of course, they will also do that, allowing us to look at the data, created this new, very, very important thing for people like Professor Al-Aryan, myself, which is a certain rigor, which is, if today I go back to that data and compare it with newly declassified documentation, excuse me, I can cross-verify and look at the declassified documentation and say, oh, this is what happened. This is how those two things connect. And 20 years, 30 years hence, we can go back to the original source. And this is really important about WikiLeaks. And that's why to this day, we know, for example, in relation to the war, the invasion of Ukraine, that we know that there was a commitment given by the NATO forces in terms of how far they would expand eastwards. And it is this commitment that Russia was relying upon. So WikiLeaks to this day is allowing us to see what is really going on in times of serious conflict. And why is it that it's important to know about things in times of serious conflict? Firstly, because we know that, for example, in the collateral murder video, there was a Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post journalist embedded in the same battalion that was involved in shooting those children and shooting those innocent civilians. And initially, what he did was he tried to explain that what they were doing, what the battalion had done, was within the rules of engagement and so should not be questioned. So journalists have their own blind spots, especially when they are embedded journalists. And also many journalists have conflicts of interest. Where they don't themselves have conflicts of interest, the owners of their multimedia corporations, mainly oligarchs and oligopolists, have a certain acceptable range of debate that they are willing to tolerate. If you go beyond that, you suddenly get disappeared. And this is why WikiLeaks is important, because it allowed a new citizen journalism in the sense of expert citizens as well as ordinary citizens for the first time to surveil the state. The state is surveilling us every day. Wherever you go, you have facial recognition cameras, you have information about how you use your credit card, you have information about whom you're talking to. But WikiLeaks allowed us ordinary people to surveil the state and changed the power balance. And that's why WikiLeaks was important. And what was most important about WikiLeaks, more than anything else, was one thing, which is courage. When the Americans asked them to take down this accurate data, to say, no, this accurate data no longer exists in the public domain, WikiLeaks said no. And they kept the information there. The Americans went after them. They got PayPal, MasterCard, and Visa to cut off the funding supply. They did all kinds of things, including putting pressure on their allies to find ways to delegitimize, smear WikiLeaks and Assange. And on some of those counts, they have been very successful. The Americans have been supported by the British, the Swedish, and of course, Australia and Ecuador. Australia, because Assange is an Australian citizen. And an Australian citizen undertaking truthful journalism about American war crimes outside America, not even on American soil, is now being held by the British in a maximum security prison where he is strip searched, moved from cell to cell, treated like he is a common criminal, a terrorist, rather than this pioneering and peaceful and hugely intelligent human being who could help us to make this world a better place is now, he's now being treated really badly. And America has been able to do that because Australia has been complicit. Sweden has been complicit. And many of you will ask me, why is Sweden complicit? And one of the reasons why Sweden has been complicit is it wanted to, we know from WikiLeaks cables, in fact, that Sweden wanted to prolong the war in Afghanistan in order to be able to sell Gripen fighter jets. And so there are reasons why individual states have their own interests. Britain has its own interests in spending £20 million surveilling one embassy. And what is really interesting about this case over the last decade is that this case is a very unusual case. Here we have an extraditing state, America, to classify publishing as espionage, number one. Then once we class publishing as espionage, we treat WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence agency. And this is very similar to the way in which they treated the people who were illegally taken off the streets of Pakistan, Afghanistan, other parts of the world, Canada even, and taken to Guantanamo, where you call somebody a terrorist, and all of a sudden accusation becomes truth. And then you don't have to give them process. In Britain, at least now, there is a shambles or a sham of a process where, firstly, we're taking the US Espionage Act, applying it to publication. We know that the United States spied on Julian Assange's privileged legal conversations. This means he's in any rule of law state, you are allowed to have private conversations with your lawyer so you can have a defense. If the state that is seeking to extradite you spies on those legal conversations, as they have done, for example, in the past with Nixon spying on, with the FBI spying on Daniel Ellsberg, the case was thrown out of court. But in Assange's case, the case has gone on. Not only that, the Americans plotted to assassinate Assange while he was in a sovereign embassy, because Assange took refuge in the embassy of Ecuador, and the Americans plotted to assassinate him there. He was removed from the embassy by the British Metropolitan Police without the due process of removing his Ecuadorian citizenship or removing his asylum. So there was no process for that. Again,
can we walk back a little bit here?
Sure.
So that the audience can follow chronologically.
Of course.
Julian is an Australian citizen. He was a journalist, an editor, a publisher, and he founded WikiLeaks in 2006. And the purpose, of course, is to have unfiltered access to information that many governments, they do dirty work and they try to hide, and WikiLeaks was trying to make them available, particularly documents that are related to war crimes, and of the sort. And as you said, and you pointed out, that it came to prominence after it released much of the war crimes taking place in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that earned him the enmity of the US government. Can you tell us a little bit, that you said that the origins of these were traced to Bradley, later Chelsea Manning, who was also arrested by the United States, court-martialed, and he was tried and convicted and sentenced to 35 years, I believe. But his sentence was commuted by Obama after 7 years. So the puzzle here, Julian is not even a US citizen, and yet he's being charged in an American court, charged by an American administration on stuff that he only published, which is supposed to be a First Amendment issue, that and the Pentagon Papers and others have gone to Supreme Court and others, and they have been deemed to have been legal act to publish them, even though they were classified, because this is because the New York Times and others are papers, and WikiLeaks has certainly been. No one is saying that this is an entity or a government or an espionage organization. This is pretty much like a publisher house or a publishing house or a magazine. So you're an legal observer. Tell me, what would be the argument that the US is trying to make, particularly after the person who leaked the documents have been released, his sentence was commuted, and yet we could see that this saga has been going on now for almost a decade. What is the argument? And why an Australian citizen being charged by an American court or an American administration?
Well, there are many arguments as to why Julian is being charged. But firstly, I think the Americans do not like their war crimes being revealed.
That's the real reason. But I mean, is there a legal argument? Because, again, the purpose of this is not only to talk about Julian, who deserves obviously every sympathy for, and because he's a hero. To me, he's a hero, because he's exposed much of the corruption and war crimes taking place around the world. But also part of this seminar here today is to show how the West talks, from both sides of the mouth. On one hand, they talk about democracy, rule of law, First Amendment, freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of the press. and due process, and yet every one of these, liberal principles that they hold over people's heads have been violated in this case. It's just amazing. I mean, some cases you may find one or two principles. Here, every single principle has been violated with impunity. And then you talk about the accomplices, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and other European countries. It's just amazing what's taking place here.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, the United States has made clear that they do not intend to allow Julian to use the First Amendment free speech defense. So that's first free speech out of the window, because they see him as a non-US citizen and therefore not entitled to First Amendment protections. And that is, of course, arguable. And if the case were ever to come to court in America, then they might argue that. The second is, the Espionage Act has no public interest defense. And that's why it's always been used against whistleblowers, because you cannot say that I leaked the information because what I was doing was good for the public. In fact, the Espionage Act and the way it's been framed is such that you can use it essentially to criminalize honest truth-telling. And the United States already criminalizes truth-telling by misusing the classification systems, where it classifies things as secret or top secret or whatever, confidential in various ways, when actually this bit of information should be in the public domain, or that bit of information should be in the public domain. And most of this classification is to hide the criminality of people within the American establishment, or to save the embarrassment of people within the American establishment.
Let's
so that's
acknowledge that the Espionage Act is an act of Congress that passed over a century ago in 1917 in order to limit dissent during World War I. Correct?
Indeed. And I think that's what shutting down WikiLeaks and preventing them from speaking is about. It's about shutting down dissent. It's shutting down anybody who questions what right America and Britain and other so-called rule of law countries have to talk about press freedom, democracy, rule of law, when actually they are the biggest criminals in the room. And this is essentially what this case is about. I think the other thing worth saying is, you asked, your first question was, what about Chelsea Manning? Now, Chelsea Manning, when she was an analyst, had access to this information. So the information that she leaked, she didn't have to hack into it or do anything of that sort. She just put it in the public domain. The criminality, so to speak, was in disclosing it. With somebody like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, I think the Americans and Britain and others are more scared of him, because it's not just one Chelsea. There are many Chelseas and many David McBrides and many Edward Snowdens and many other Craig Murrays, for example, who revealed torture in Uzbekistan. All of these people need a place to be able to give their information to, because most whistleblowers end up losing their jobs, losing their respectability in society, losing their livelihoods, often losing their lives. So Julian Assange is an enabler of the people who because most of us, let's say we have a brother or a sister in prison, or we have a brother or a sister or a grandparent in a care home. We don't really know what goes on every day. We have a mother or father in hospital. We don't really know what's going on. We're not experts. We're not there 24/7. The people who really know need to be able to tell us when something wrong is going on. And that's what WikiLeaks is. It's providing a bit of light in the darkness and giving light to the room. And that's what Julian Assange and others have done. Because it is these whistleblowers who come and provide the light and allow us to see what's really going on. And so that's the difference between a whistleblower and a journalist. Because Julian is a publisher, and I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable calling Julian a journalist. But Julian has won all the major journalism awards in the world. He is also, very importantly, one of the most prolific publishers. And if you've seen any of his programs on on various channels, including Russia Today, you will see that he's got very insightful questions and comments to make. And this is why Julian as a journalist is being pursued. I think there is also this question of democracy and people's right to know. So it's not, you're right, it's not about Julian. Of course, we are sad for his family. He's got 2 children. Well, he's got several children, but the young children whom he has with his wife have never seen their father outside a prison. And it's sad for them. And it's sad for his 80-odd-year-old father. But what it's really sad for is the people of the world who don't really know what's going on and finally had some power, a little bit of power, to exercise their democratic rights. And that's whom it's most sad for. Sorry.
God bless you, Dr. Driver. I wanted to jump in here. I wanted to ask, I have a couple of questions. Number one, I want to pick up on what you said about being the biggest criminal in the room. The reason I want to pick up on that is because, you know, people who live in the global South often look at, for various reasons, citizens in the global North as living in under what you rightly termed supposedly the ideal of the rule of law. And there are many cases, right, that come into the public domain or in news of the poor guy getting justice in a way that we don't see that often. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen in courtrooms in places like India, Pakistan, you know, Turkey or Egypt. But the way that it's presented, right, is that there is this kind of impeccable standard of rule of law in the West. Julian Assange's case puts this whole thing into question. But if you could give the viewers a kind of general theory of the limits of rule of law in developed nations, like where does, I know that Julian Assange is a very particular case, but putting that aside, how should, maybe even I'm speaking from the standpoint of a kind of inferiority complex, but how should people living in the global South understand this whole production of the liberal standard of the rule of law, and how should they navigate it and think about that? I'm asking for a more general landscape, and then maybe you could fill in according to your own experience how we should be theorizing it.
There's a great question, and I'm hesitating because I am not a theoretician in this space. But let me offer you a few thoughts, and perhaps we can draw some ideas in. Firstly, I think as somebody who grew up in the global South, you're right. We somehow believe that the West has better standards, does things better, and at least I did when I was growing up, that it would be a better place to live. And for a lot of people, the difference in absolute standard of living in terms of, you know, income, etc., makes a big difference. And I certainly found that when I moved over to the West. But what you also begin to realize is the reason our countries are poor, the reason our countries are quote unquote backward in some ways, is partly because of imperialism and colonialism, which have extracted a lot of wealth from our countries. But that's not to excuse much of the corruption and the infighting and the destruction that goes on, which we inflict upon ourselves when we are in the global South. But it is a reason why we are struggling despite being very resource rich, ordinary people continue to struggle. And while many of us have left this imperial yoke, so to speak, and, you know, we've had our Independence Day in 1947 in India, and in other parts of the world, you have, you know, all across Africa, you have various nations celebrating their independence. The imperial hand still sits choking our throats because the companies in the West, the corporations of the West, and the political powers of the West still control the resources in our countries. They also control the education, the knowledge, the predominant thinking that is amongst the elites in our countries, the people who rule our countries, whether it is in wherever you look in Asia, for example, where I grew up. The richest families send their children to Britain and America or to France or wherever else to study, where they then imbibe this neoliberal mindset, which on the one hand they use to exploit ordinary people in our countries, while on the other hand saying, oh, don't you think India is great? Don't you think Pakistan is great? Don't you think whatever else is great because we've got these great values? I think we mustn't excuse ourselves in our complicity in this, because this does not happen just because Britain and America do it in the same way. It is also because we fuel that engine, because each of us wants to have a share of that little pie. And in doing that, we are all in various ways selling our souls. Now, coming back to the other question, which was a more theoretical question on the rule of law, I think, firstly, this idea of the rule of law is a bit of a nice theoretical idea which you can put out into the public domain and pretend as though people are better. But the law exists to protect the interests of the rich and the powerful. The law does not exist to protect ordinary people. At least that's my opinion. Obviously, it's not what they teach you in the law school. Mm. But we, as ordinary citizens, then use the law. Of course, they construct it to protect property. We use it to protect our rights. And that protection of our rights doesn't come through the law. It comes through democratic power, through putting people in positions of power who interpret the law in a way that allows us various freedoms. So to my mind, okay, if you're thinking about the rule of law, the kinds of things you expect are institutions where the same process applies to everybody. So when you are Julian Assange and you are told that you cannot have, your case has to go through quickly, more quick than everybody else, when the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service in the United Kingdom, writes to Sweden, quote unquote, this is not being treated like any other extradition, then what we're saying is the institutions don't work. Just like in India, just like in Pakistan, just like in Egypt, just like in Turkey, the institutions don't work. We're also saying when America, which is not, the domestic power here in Britain, when America tells Britain, we want you to take this journalist and put him in prison, and the British judicial system and the lawyers and the judges are willing to honor that, then there is something wrong, because in a rule of law system, you have a separation between politics and the law and the judiciary. And when politics and political power is able to change judicial outcomes, then you do not have a rule of law state. When a foreign state spies on the privileged legal conversations, the concept of legal privilege is fundamental to the rule of law. The privacy of these conversations so that both sides have some equality in terms of their power in the courtroom. Again, that's not a rule of law state. So there's a few more things, and I can see I've spoken for a little while, and I'm keen to hear what you have to say too. So please feel free.
No, this is really very interesting regarding the rule of law and the fact that your observation that the current law is really written in order to preserve the privilege of the rich and the powerful. I mean, even what is called the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution, it was originally written that those who will exercise power, exercise even democratic institutions, would have to be landowners, would have to be white. Black people were discounted. They were only counted as 3/5 of the person in order to count them as people for the purpose of representation of white people in Congress. But also women were discounted, and landless or people who didn't own land also did not count. So from the very beginning, these things were taken into consideration. Of course, over time it got better, but yet today you could see what you have is a society that is ruled pretty much by the powerful and the rich. The Supreme Court represent the interest of these people, and for the most part, Congress does as well. And very rarely will they try to champion the people. Most people don't know, for example, that 40% of the people in the United States, that's over 100 million people, don't even have $1,000 in the bank, meaning that if they don't work for a couple of months and they run out of unemployment, they might be in the streets. At any rate, I think that observation is pointed. But when we go back, and focus on law, you could see also that in the United States, much of the legal procedure, when you really, and there is a very great book actually by David Cole, the Georgetown constitutional professor, and his book was Unequal Justice, when he compares much of the law, of the cases, and I saw this firsthand. When you go in prison, you'll find that over 50% of the people there incarcerated are people of color, and they only represent less than, particularly blacks, less than 12% of the population. Yet they are over 50% of the imprisoned in federal and state prisoners. At any rate, so there is a lot of inequality. There's a lot of, and the law doesn't really, I can go on and on with this because I experienced it. At any rate, I think that's one aspect that needs to be pointed out. We talked about democratic practices, and we could see that in the case of Julian, these have been, really thrown out. No, they don't respect them. And yet, President Biden the other day was going after Russia and after different countries, said this is, and this is, by the way, this was written in the new released National Security Strategy of the United States. They're talking about the real fight today is between two segments or two categories of states: democracies versus autocracies, and those who, they say it in straight face, and those who honor order and law versus those who don't. And as if the United States, when it invaded Iraq and committed all these war crimes, actually even seemingly got the approval of the United Nations. They just ignored them completely, and they just went an invasion. So going back to Oasis' question, he talked about generally speaking, and you made good comments. But when we go to the issue of Assange himself, I'm still perplexed by, even though I can understand that a lot of things have been used, but from the legal standpoint, this has been going on for over a decade, and his lawyers have been arguing. But some of these arguments, to me, they don't seem to be deep. The fact that he's suicidal, or the fact that he's not gonna, or he may be sentenced to death because that's part of the Espionage Act. But why not the meat of the issue, the question of the rights of people to know? Because again, I'm going back to the issue to Ellsberg. There is a Supreme Court. Is that because he is being charged under the Espionage Act? And can the United States actually charge any person in the world under this act, even though they are outside the United States jurisdiction? And what does that say about the state of the world? The United States has now global jurisdiction, that they can charge any person they want. No one is immune, that they can have their hands on anybody that they want as they wish. And then those governments who are in the service or client states, it looks like the United Kingdom has been a client state, they can just get away with it. Can you comment on that?
Certainly, and that's a phenomenal question. Firstly, this is a peculiarity of how extradition law in the UK works. The way extradition law works is that if you are a particular category of state, certain European jurisdictions and the Five Eyes countries, these are Britain, Australia, New Zealand, America, etc.
And Canada.
And Canada, of course, yes. They are treated as equivalent jurisdictions in that we expect that the legal systems there will treat prisoners in a certain way, etc., etc. The legal systems are equivalent, and so we don't have to establish that the person actually committed a crime. All they have to say is give a request within the local extradition treaty to ask for this person. Now, you asked a very good question. Why isn't it that they're arguing the substance of the case, which is about democracy, about press freedom, etc.? And the answer is because of the way the extradition treaty and the Extradition Act work, sorry, I'm having a terrible cough today. There is a presumption in favor of extradition. So it is expected that you will be extradited unless you hit certain bars. And one of those bars is the possibility that your health conditions will not be looked after in the same way in the prisons in the other state. So at that initial stage, all his lawyers could do over the last few years is to argue that his health is so bad, he's in terrible health. He was bending to tie a shoelace. He's got osteoporosis. He was bending to tie a shoelace and he cracked a rib. So the deprivation of sunlight has had a long effect. His chronic depression has had a long effect. He's had a lung condition, which of course during COVID was a huge risk. He has a shoulder injury where they knew he had to be taken for treatment while he was in the embassy, and Britain did not give permission for him to go to hospital. He had a tooth injury where he had a broken tooth, where he needed, root canal surgery. And you and I know when we're having tooth pain, how quickly we want to go to the doctor. For several years, he was not allowed to go to the dentist having proper treatment. So his health is in a very, very bad state. And so they were able to argue that the United States cannot offer conditions. And what did the United States do once this argument had been made and Julian had won his case, even on their unbalanced kind of approach? They said, we provide diplomatic assurances that everything will be fine and we won't torture him. But we know from other diplomatic assurances, for example, diplomatic assurances even in Sweden, where two Egyptian men, El-Zari and Agiza, who were asylum seekers in Sweden, were sent to a CIA black site and tortured on the back of diplomatic assurances. In America, we know so many people who've been extradited to America on the back of diplomatic assurances who have thereafter those diplomatic assurances have not been honored. And Julian will be kept in conditions of extreme isolation, where he will only be able to talk to his family twice a month on the telephone. All his conversations with his lawyers and with his family will be monitored. And where have we seen this before? We have seen it in the case of the 779 Muslim men and boys who were taken to Guantanamo, who were accused of a crime.
That is standard. I've been there. It's actually once a month for 15 minutes, not even twice a month. If you're in isolation in U.S. federal prison, all what you get is 15 minutes a month in a monitored conversation with your family. And oftentimes, if you hit the wrong button and you don't get them because they were not home or something, you lose it, and then on to the next month. It's ridiculous. It's actually mental torture, psychological torture. That's what they subject people, and that's even before they go to trial.
Yes, and in the case of Julian, the psychological torture has been initially not have, the key things about psychological torture are isolation through either smearing or through physical isolation. They are also about arbitrariness in the process, arbitrariness in the application of the law, arbitrariness in terms of everything that applies to everybody else. For example, the guy who was Julian's mentor and father died, and other prisoners who have committed murders have been allowed out to attend the funeral. Julian wasn't allowed. So all of this is aimed at, firstly, destroying Julian, the individual, but also aimed at, and this is what all torture seeks to do, whether it was at Guantanamo, whether it was anywhere else, it seeks to send a message to everybody else that if you dare to go down this path, we will do this to you. And that's what America is trying to do. It's holding Julian Assange's head on a stake and saying, look, this is what we do. Like it has done with Guantanamo prisoners, because we know that the majority of the men who were at Guantanamo were not people who could have committed the kinds of crimes that they were accused of, were not people who, even if they had committed the crimes, let's do the thought experiment and say they committed all these crimes, they should not have been treated in the way they were treated. And if you are supposedly a more civilized state and you behave in this way, then what is different between you and the so-called other states? And who are you to tell other countries how to behave?
I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to speak with you, Dr. Driver. I mean, things that you're bringing up are so insightful, because like you said at the beginning of your talk, for a lot of us, who are just distant from actions that are taking place in what you call the dark corners of the world, we have no access of understanding them. And so therefore I think we exercise kind of an extreme level of benefit of the doubt. But what you're calling us to do is to really look at the facts. And I really am really appreciative of that. One of the things that I find, and this ties back to my first question, and I was trying to think with you about what resources citizens have to think about what are brave actions, right? And what the concept of a whistleblower does for us is that it problematizes categories such as espionage and treason, because what is really being fought here on the case of Julian Assange is that we are trying to take back the idea of the state's ability to declare by decision, basically, who is a traitor and who is a spy and who is an enemy of the state. And I asked for a kind of more general theory because there might be other locations in the law, right, where we will have to think about ways and concepts to re-articulate those or re-narrativize and take back basically this vast ocean of just basically discretion that the state enjoys in pinpointing, who are persona non grata for the state and its interests. And so, yeah, thinking about the concept of whistleblower, I think is very productive here. And like you said, trying to re-describe actions of these very brave people in a new light. And I'm sure that there's other areas of law also that this would be useful. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think with you. So
yeah. One of the things I was going to say in response to that was, we always think of hackers or whistleblowers as the problem. Whereas actually these are the people who are saying, hey, the system isn't working as it should. And these are the people who are upholding the system rather than the people who are putting a curtain around the system when it's broken and pretending as though everything is okay when it's not. So I think and there are so many things at least when I was young, you were always taught, keep your head down, don't get into trouble, don't question the government. And we begin to imbibe this in who we are. And one of the things that happens is the more we stay silent, the more we learn not to talk. And over time, when it's really important, we are unable to stand up and even protect the things that are really dear to us. Because I talk to my family all the time about various things, and as with any family, people have different views, and people say, oh, well, why don't you just look after your family and your children? Why should you be going out and looking at this case of Assange? Why do you want to attract American attention? And of course, there is a certain amount of hidden, although they will not call it that, hidden misogyny as well there, because the idea is, who is this brown woman to go and talk about what is happening in a white man's court? Whether even with friends, I'm not saying my friends are misogynists. I'm just saying that this is not something an Indian girl does. You just sit at home, maybe make a nice meal, but the reality is, if we want a better world for our children, if we are not doing this just for ourselves, we are doing it because what is the point of looking after your children if tomorrow one of them does something amazing and intelligent and turns out to be really
I think her internet, is that us or is that her?
Oh, I think we lost, but let's see. Let's wait.
silent, and therefore there is no justice? Does that, sorry, can I still be heard?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You may want to repeat
So-
the last sentence because we lost you for a second. Yeah.
I beg your pardon, sorry. I was just saying, for example, if one of my children, if they are hurt on the street of London, murdered or killed, would I not want for there to be justice? And why should Doa and Sajjad get less justice than my children? Why is their life less important than my children's lives? And what kind of world do I want to leave for my friends, my children, my grandchildren, if I don't stand up and speak now? And I realize that, sorry, can I just, I just
finish the thought, yeah.
Sorry, I've gone on for a bit. One of the things is that we always think that somebody else will do it. And also, not only that somebody else will do it, that if we don't do it, it will somehow happen. And both of those are complete myths.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to just on that point, one of the advantages that the American administration, especially, I mean, I saw a number of interviews that were done by American officials, and one of the things that they have been able to do is to muddy the waters, right, between a whistleblower and a spy or a traitor, and that's actually works in their advantage because it leaves ordinary people in a place of doubt, right? And I think one of the things that we have to do is distinguish very clearly that, well, yeah, there might be something like a traitor, I don't know, but a whistleblower, right, is an entirely different species, right? It's a different creature, and it's not okay for us to even like entertain the doubt that a bona fide whistleblower could be tainted with this idea of also being a spy. I mean, there has to be conceptual clarity on this, or else, a lot of regular people I've spoken to about the Assange case or about the Chelsea Manning case, they're like, look, man, states need to have categories of, you can't just have people leaking everything, right? I mean, how will the state work, right? I mean, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, right? So what I'm saying is that as we articulate what a whistleblower is, I think we need to have a very clear distinction that like what we're talking about here is a clear whistleblower. And it actually works in the advantage of states to muddy the waters, right? Whether a person is a journalist or whether they're a traitor, whether they are, these kinds of things. So maybe you could speak a little bit more about how Julian Assange is definitely not, under law, legally speaking, could ever be categorized as a spy or something like that. Which it may be clear to you, but just for the common popular kind of understanding of things.
When you ask these questions, you're helping me crystallize what process I've gone through in my head, but haven't put into words. So it's really helpful. Thank you. Firstly, yes, states do have to keep secrets. So, for example, we do not want the nuclear codes published and for everybody to have them. Right? That's a very clear example of what secrets states should have. But when states use secrecy and not if the state is the apparatus that is elected by us, but when these people who are in positions of power, who have a lot of delegated authority misuse that power to classify away their crimes, that's when we have a problem. And that's why what Chelsea did and what Julian did are important, because even though they were revealing classified information, the information was such that it revealed the truth of the war crime that had gone on. So the criminality of it had already taken place.
So there's already a mechanism that is already legalized, what you're calling classification, right? So it's this like very bureaucratic, technical process by which it guards, right? What you're saying are basically war crimes and other kinds of criminality that is regularly going on. And so you have this idea of classification that already protects. And so, you know, I think what you're trying to say is that like there are certain things that are being classified which shouldn't be classified as secrets, right?
Absolutely. So, for example, let's take a very simple example. If I was to take my husband and chop his head off in the bedroom, and then say, I have an issue of privacy if you find out what's going on, you will laugh at me. And that's what states are doing. They are going to another country illegally, in the case, for example, in Iraq, where Tony Blair and George Bush both lied us into a false war, and going and killing innocent civilians. And the ordinary working people in Britain and America gain nothing from the deaths of Iraqi, Palestinian, Syrian, Libyan, Algerian, and other people. The people who gain are the big weapons companies. And Julian Assange said this very well, which is war is a way to launder money from us to either the weapons companies or the, mercenary companies who then go into these jurisdictions and play Rambo and actually kill lots of innocent people. And there are reasons to go to war which must be taken very seriously, and illegal invasions cannot be classified away. So
you have two questions here, Deepak, for you. One, just to sum up what you've been saying, is that Julian Assange is really a hero because he is suffering so the rest of the world would know the truth. And secondly, yes, he's paying a heavy price, but at the same time, he is lauding a higher principle. And even though many people have come to support him, champion his cause, we see that many of the traditional human rights activists and organizations have not really come strong enough to make the world say in unison that he should be left alone, that he is a hero, he should not be prosecuted, he should not be treated inhumanely as he's been, particularly in a country that he didn't harm. I mean, he didn't do anything to Britain. And even in the United States, as I said, the culprit, the person who leaked the documents or the videos that he's being prosecuted, he himself has been pardoned. I mean, for Obama to come and pardon Chelsea Manning, that means he felt that this person had done something that he shouldn't be punished for. Otherwise, why would he pardon him? So there is something here that I know imperialist countries don't want to be challenged, that they, particularly when they are exposed, like what WikiLeaks have done. So in your opinion, are there other reasons than just the haughtiness and the arrogance of the international system and the fact that they have a stronghold or grip on the United Kingdom? And secondly, that's one question. And secondly, why haven't the human rights activist organizations been at the forefront of this case? Why we're just hearing about it, here and there, now and then, and not continuously? Why we haven't seen this as being one of the biggest cases in the 21st century when it comes to the abuses of so-called democratic governments? Why do you think that is?
Firstly, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, all the usual suspects have now said very clearly that they, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, have now said very clearly that they support Assange, that they do not want him to be extradited. Well, support Assange is a bit of an overstatement, but at least that they do not wish him to be extradited. I've just taken off my earphones, so I hope you can still hear me. I think the quality might be slightly better. All the major newspapers, including the shameless Guardian newspaper, which published the information which resulted in the publication of the diplomatic cables, whose journalists published the information rather. All of these people are now saying don't extradite Assange because, oh, that sets a chilling precedent for press freedom. But actually the chilling precedent has also already been set. If today somebody was to receive the collateral murder video or the Guantanamo Bay documents, will they publish it? Think of any major Western newspaper and think about whether they will publish it. And the Americans have been successful in some ways at that. But there are still others who are still fighting. And so the Americans need to keep keeping them down. I think the tipping point for Assange was in relation to various documents which he's not being prosecuted for. So he's being prosecuted for the release of the diplomatic cables, the Guantanamo Bay detainee assessment briefs, the Iraq war logs, and the Afghan war diaries. So everything else he is not being prosecuted for. But what has been used is the everything else to pretend that, oh, let's get the Democratic support away from Assange by saying he let Trump come into the White House. Or let's smear Assange by saying something about, they've said weird things like his personal hygiene. He smeared feces on the wall. He tormented his cat. He assaulted women. The lies just keep coming and coming and coming. Mm-hmm. And somewhere or other, people, after a period of 10 years, start to think, well, if they said all that about him, some of it might be true. But I urge all these people to think, let's assume Assange is a cat torturer. Let's assume Assange is a sexual assault criminal. Should he then be put in an American prison for 175 years for publishing truthful information? And any reasonable person will say, well, the two things are completely separate. If you want to go after him for those other things, go after him for those other things and, deal with that. But if you use that, which the Americans have very cleverly done, like they did with, calling the Guantanamo Bay detainees the worst of the worst. What do? They put the fear into your hearts that if you think of them as human beings, then actually they will do some harm to you. So if you think of Assange as a human being, you've got so many things going wrong in the world. People are struggling to pay their electricity bill. People are struggling to put food on the table, look after their children. They don't have time to think about Assange. And that's why we must talk about it. And I'm so grateful that you allowed me to come here and talk to you about it.
If I may, and then Always can jump in. I know that we've talked enough about the case, but what can people do? What do you think the average person and also activists could do, not just to bring this case to light or to inform people about it, but to actually make a difference in the outcome of the case?
Well, I guess the first thing to do is, if you're an American citizen, and write to your representative and ask them to put pressure on the Biden administration to drop the charges. That's the first thing you can do, very practically. If you're in Britain, please turn up for the court hearings. There are gatherings outside. There are also weekly gatherings at Belmarsh on Saturdays, run by the Grassroots Support Group.
Belmarsh is the prison for his house, right?
Yes, and it's this horrible grey place that looks grey and horrible and damp, even in the summer. It looks cold. And very practically, there are two movies that are currently going around. One is called Ithaca, and it is the family's story of what they've seen in the last 3 years and what they've gone through. And the second is called Hacking Justice. I don't like the title of the movie, but it's a very, very good movie comparing Balthazar Garzon, who prosecuted Pinochet, and Julian Assange, because Balthazar is Julian's international lawyer. So it's a very, very good introduction to what's happening in the case, and it's done really well. Please organize a viewing for it, even in your family group or your local community group. It is also useful if you can invite people like me. I am very willing to come to even small groups of 5 and 10 people to talk about the case, because the more people who understand what's going on, the more that can be done. If you're in Australia, please put pressure on the Australian government to protect its citizen, because Australia has been complicit in the framing of Assange. And Albanese said, enough is enough some years ago, but now when he is in power, he is sucking up to Joe Biden and not protecting his citizens. So it's really important that people put pressure where they are. And even if you can, if all you can do is put a little leaflet in your window, do that. If you can organize a community action, you can go and stand at a protest with a flag, do that. If you can organize a big event at your university or hospital or college, do that. Whatever it takes. Buy Professor Niels Meltzer's book, The Trial of Julian Assange, and a wonderful new book that has only come out 2 weeks ago by Stefania Maurizi, the Italian journalist, which is like a little thriller. It's a fantastic book. I have been amazed at how beautifully she describes what's going on in the world. I urge
what are the names of those books again? Can you say that again?
Of course. It's The Trial of Julian Assange by Professor Niels Meltzer. He is the former UN rapporteur on torture who examined the Swedish case and also examined Julian in prison. So that's a really important book. And the other book is by an Italian journalist who worked closely with WikiLeaks on its main releases in relation to corruption in Italy, and also in relation to abductions of people off the streets of Rome. Her name is Stefania Maurizi, Maurizi. And her book is called, let me show it to you, it's right in front of me, Secret Power, WikiLeaks and its Enemies. So this is an interesting book, and the other book is somewhere here on my shelf. I will show it to you before we finish.
And Wikipedia, if you can, just for the benefit of the audience, has been run from different websites, different countries. So
WikiLeaks, I think you mean.
You mean WikiLeaks rather than Wikipedia?
Sorry. I mean WikiLeaks, yes. I mean WikiLeaks has been run from different sites, different countries, so there is no one jurisdiction that could come and try to shut it down, correct?
Well, I don't know where its servers are, and that's very important that people like me don't know, because that's how WikiLeaks is able to provide the security of the documents and the sources. So yes, it is run from all over the world, and there are people from all over the world helping to keep it going.
So it's more like a movement. It's developed not just, as a site where people could find out what's going on behind closed doors and the secrets, the dirty secrets of governments, but it's becoming more like a movement, which gives me some hope for the future.
Certainly, and it's, one of the wonderful phrases I think Julian used is courage is contagious. And when I look at, for example, what you have done and your courage in standing up to one of the world's strongest powers, what we learn is we can do it. It comes at great cost, but we can do it. And it is only when we do it that the world is a better place and our lives are worth living. So it is as much for us we do it as we do it for others.
As our time is running short, I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned about because it's the theme on which I think the curtain that was pulled, right, that WikiLeaks allowed for us to see was that the fog of war isn't actually that foggy. That in the 21st century, there was this perception, especially amongst, again, I keep bringing this up, is that from the global South, right? In a certain position of the global South, I shouldn't say, I mean, there's a lot of people that are not in this position, but I'm saying the popular production of what is being consumed in the mainstream media is that, you know, when democracies go to war, right, their armies and their operations are smart, professional, sophisticated, right? That civilians are protected, you know, and there isn't indiscriminate killing, right, that's going on, as opposed to, for instance, a militia in Iraq, or a militia, or a third world army, right? These are two different species, and when these developed, these developed nations go to war, we should give deference to their decision, because not only do they go to war for noble principles, but also as they conduct war, their character is much more elevated. And this ties into that perception of rule of law that you had problematized earlier. So could you please speak about how this particular notion of professional war was problematized by WikiLeaks?
Sorry, I was trying to, my children are roller skating in the corridor outside.
No problem.
Trying to calm them down. But firstly, I wanted to go back to your lovely phrasing. And one of the things I wanted to say was, people have to be lied into war. Shh, 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 please. Sorry. People have to be lied into war. And what we have in terms of information, in terms of people's reaction when they see the truth, is incredibly powerful. And when we see this in, we saw this in the Arab Spring, we see it in other parts of the world, everywhere, that when people understand the truth about what's going on, even the most powerful places change. So I have a friend who was in South Africa during apartheid, and South Africa's regime was at its most brutal just before apartheid fell. And it's the same in Germany before the Berlin Wall went down, where there was a lot of repression on various sides before the wall went down. And so there is a certain power in democracy and truth. And it is why the other side, the intelligence agencies, etc., have to try so hard to keep us quiet. And they try various techniques, and despite that, democracy survives. So I guess in some ways I'm saying, on the one hand, you were saying earlier, oh, what about, we think that these things only happen with the militias and they don't, somehow it's much more sanitized in the West. And yes, they are better at dressing it up. But when, let's take a completely different example. Let's take corruption. But when you look at the corruption, people, when they talk about corruption, often talk about corruption in Africa and the African dictators. But where do the African dictators launder their money through? Through Delaware, through the City of London, through Switzerland, through these so-called places which are the rule of law. And these kinds of countries which are providing a veneer of this sort are not doing it for the benefit of ordinary people here. Ordinary people here are also suffering. The largest number of people, we are having the largest number of people in Britain now who are in poverty, despite being in work. So children going without a lunchtime meal. And this is supposedly a developed country. So I do not justify the behavior of tyrannical despots in other parts of the world. I do not justify the corruption that I saw when I was growing up in India. I do not justify the kind of brazen attempts at, destruction of religions, of communities in various parts of the world that we're seeing today. But I also say that Britain and America and Switzerland and France are not the beacons we make them out to be.
We got only 10 minutes left, and I would really like to bring this to the point that the title was, that this seminar was titled, which is Examining Western Stated Values, and particularly when looking into the case of Julian Assange. We talked about, these democratic and liberal values. The West always tries to talk to the world about, most often talking down at them, but yet we hear it all the time. And after all the things that WikiLeaks have published and exposed the double standards, the way the wars are being conducted in the name of democracies, and the punishment of that person who was just a messenger. He didn't commit these things. He was just a messenger. He brought these things to light. He made the world see that the words do not match actions. And therefore, people should re-examine those leaders who lie to them, and they commit war crimes and genocides and atrocities in the name of democracy, which really should put everybody on notice that if you are a true champion of democratic ideals, of liberal values, then you should be championing Assange and protesting and demonstrating against those war criminals, whether they were in the White House or Whitehall, whether they were in Downing Street or Pennsylvania Street. I mean, these are the people who actually perpetrated these crimes. And for them to actually have the audacity and go and charge Assange and go after him in a way that is so brutal that they can get away with it, and they may even actually succeed in bringing him and destroying him after they're trying to destroy his reputation, is unbelievable. So what would be your departing words as we conclude this session, having witnessed this in a very close way? What would you tell people? You said a few things about going and contacting Congress if you're an American citizen, or but I'm talking more about normal person, how they should look at the West. And when they say things like that, we shouldn't say, what about Assange? I'm trying to put this back into not, particularly in how we can make a difference now, but more into our thought process when we hear these Western leaders, these so-called democratic leaders, or the leaders of the free world, when they talk, and all what we see really is hypocrisy.
Well, firstly, I'd like to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Firstly, the truth matters. And why does the truth matter? Because we care about equality and justice. And neither equality nor justice can be delivered without us understanding the truth. And that's why WikiLeaks is important. That's why Julian is important. That's why democracy and press freedom are important. Because we won't have justice and we won't have equality if those who are in positions of power cannot be scrutinized, cannot be held accountable when they commit crimes, when they misuse power. Secondly, I think it's important to recognize that whether it is the media or whether it is other sources of information on the internet, etc., many of the pieces of information that we hear are presented through various lenses, of course, which we all do, but also some are actively planted. And Britain and America and the developed world is particularly good at that. And while they talk about press freedom and democracy, and you're right, they are hypocrites about it, I think it's also important that we in the developing world, those of us who care about the global South, recognize that just saying, oh yeah, America does it too, or oh, Britain does it too, or France does it too, doesn't make lives better for ordinary people in our countries. And if we consider ourselves to be civilized, if we consider our civilizations to be long, our religions to have a great history, then we must commit ourselves to equality and justice in whatever little space we have. And that commitment to equality and justice cannot just be a relative commitment saying, oh, America's terrible and we're slightly less terrible. It has to be about genuinely making change and taking actions that hold the powerful to account. And if you can't do it, support those who can, like WikiLeaks or Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, for example. You know, there are various ways in which people see justice and equality being delivered. And do what you can do where you are through political change, through social action, through contributions in your community, and do it through critically engaging with the news and with the media, not just accepting it and buying whatever the BBC says.
Thank you very much. Today, I think this was a very special webinar because very few times are we able to, in our lifetime, right, see such a clear case of the state in a brazen fashion go after its interests without any due consideration to justice and to rule of law or any kind of rights. So it brings into relief the iceberg sitting underneath, right? And I think that is what I think this webinar has able to point us in that direction. For the students and the staff, I can say very clearly that this points to an area of research and of kind of what you said earlier, kind of citizen concern in very important direction. And I think if we could, I know that probably our community, academic community here who is tuning in may not have the access to influence the Assange case, but at least in a local level, what we can do is begin to explore creative ways in the ways that Assange has done through WikiLeaks, and how to maintain that legacy and that space for whistleblowers, for citizens concerned with justice. And I think that is also a very important addition that I would like to add. In closing, with your permission, Dr. Driver, I would like to thank you and thank all of those who are participating today. And hopefully one day we'll be able to see you in Istanbul at CIGA. And it was a pleasure to hear from you. For all those tuning in, please stay tuned for our...
If I may, Uwais, I just want to ask Dr. Deepa Driver to convey to Assange, through whatever means you can, of our support for his case, and we will continue to advocate on his behalf, and that he's not alone. And there are a lot of people in the Global South who are very grateful to the things that he did and the stuff that he exposed, the powerful people, the companies, the countries, the imperialists. And we thank you. I reiterate, our gratefulness for you to be with us tonight. And I wish you the best and hope to see you, as always said, someday in Istanbul.
Thank you. I would love to visit.
All right.
Thank you very much.